Here is something that almost nobody talks about. When most people think about Scotland's wealth, they picture oil rigs. Giant metal towers standing in the cold grey waters of the North Sea, pumping black gold up from the ocean floor. For decades, politicians argued and debated over who owned all that oil. Countries looked at Scotland and said, "Lucky them." And for a while, the oil really did seem like the ultimate prize. But here is the truth that history quietly reveals when you look closely enough. The liquid that actually built Scotland's lasting fortune wasn't black, it was amber. And it didn't come from the bottom of the sea. It came from barley, water, and centuries of stubborn, brilliant, half-illegal craftsmanship. Today, Scotland exports over £5 billion worth of that amber liquid every single year, to more than 180 countries around the world. That is 44 bottles of Scotch whisky leaving Scottish shores every single second of every single day. The oil, meanwhile, peaked back in 1999 and has been declining ever since. So how did a cold, rocky island at the edge of Europe turn a simple grain drink into one of the most powerful economic forces on the planet? The answer takes us back 500 years through tax collectors, smugglers, a devastating plague of insects in France, and one of the most resilient industries ever built by human hands. To understand why whiskey matters so much to Scotland, you first have to understand just how difficult Scotland's situation was for most of its history. Picture the place in your mind. Not the romantic version from postcards, but the real thing. Cold, wet and windswept for most of the year. Thin soil that barely supported crops. Winters that dragged on and on. Summers that were short and unreliable. The highlands in particular were extraordinarily harsh places to survive. There were few roads, few resources, and almost no way to build the kind of trade economy that could lift people out of poverty. Scotland wasn't a rich country. For most of its early history, it was a poor and struggling one. And yet, buried inside that difficulty was something remarkable. Scotland had perfect conditions for one specific thing: clean, cold water. Lots and lots of it, rushing down from the hills through granite and peat. Acres of barley that could survive the cool, damp climate. And an endless supply of peat itself, cut from the bogs, which could be burned to dry the malted barley and give the resulting spirit a deeply smoky flavor, unlike anything produced anywhere else in the world. These weren't advantages anyone planned for. They were just there, waiting to be discovered. The first written record of whiskey in Scotland appears in 1494, in a document called the Exchequer Rolls of Scotland. In those records, a monk named Friar John Core was given 8 bowls of malt to make something called aqua vitae, which is Latin for water of life. In Scottish Gaelic, the same phrase is Uisce Beatha, and over centuries of use and mispronunciation, those two Gaelic words slowly transformed into the word we know today: whiskey. Even at that very beginning, there is something poetic about it. The water of life. Scotland's entire economic future was hiding in a monk's recipe. For the next 300 years, whiskey making spread across Scotland quietly, organically, mostly in small farms and cottages in the highlands. It wasn't glamorous, it was practical. Surplus grain that couldn't be stored or sold could be distilled into spirit, which could be stored, traded, or simply enjoyed through the brutal winter months. Whiskey became woven into Scottish life the way bread was woven into other cultures. It was hospitality, it was warmth, it was identity. Then the government got involved and everything got complicated. After the Act of Union between Scotland and England in 1707, Scottish distillers were brought under English tax law for the first time. The new duties were steep and poorly understood. Almost immediately, most small distillers made a simple decision. They would keep making whiskey. They just wouldn't tell anybody about it. Illegal distilling exploded across the Scottish Highlands. Hundreds of hidden stills appeared in remote glens, behind waterfalls, deep inside hillsides. The cat-and-mouse game between local distillers and government tax collectors became one of the defining features of Scottish life. Highland communities developed an almost heroic level of skill at hiding their operations, warning each other about inspectors, and moving product across the hills in the dead of night. Here is something remarkable about this period that most people miss. The smugglers weren't outlaws in the eyes of their own communities. They were respected. In many Highland towns, virtually everyone was involved one way or another, either in making the whiskey, hiding it, moving it, or simply looking the other way. The government's attempt to control the industry had the opposite effect. It drove the entire practice underground, removed any incentive to improve quality or consistency, and turned an entire nation into professional rule breakers. By the early 1800s, it was estimated that more than half of all the whiskey consumed in Scotland was produced illegally. The government was losing enormous amounts of tax revenue, and the distillers were producing wildly inconsistent product with no accountability and no oversight. This couldn't go on forever. And the person who finally pushed for change came from an unexpected place: the aristocracy. A Scottish nobleman called the Duke of Gordon, who owned vast estates in the Highlands where much of the finest illegal whiskey was being made, stood up in the House of Lords and made a simple argument. He told the government that it was absurd to keep fighting this industry. The Scottish people were going to make whiskey no matter what. The question was whether the government wanted to collect tax on it or not. His argument was so logical, so impossible to refute, that Parliament eventually listened. In 1823, the Excise Act was passed. It slashed the tax on legal whiskey production and created a straightforward licensing system. For just £10 a year, a distiller could operate completely legally, above ground, without hiding anything. The result was immediate and extraordinary. Within a few years, whiskey production in Scotland nearly doubled, then doubled again. Distilleries that had been hidden in hillsides came blinking into the open. The most famous example was a man named George Smith, who owned an estate in a valley called Glenlivet in the Speyside region. George Smith became one of the very first distillers to take out a legal license under the new act in 1824. His neighbors thought he was insane. Some of them threatened him directly. The illegal operators didn't want competition. But George Smith had made a bet on the future, and he was right. The Glenlivet became so famous, so associated with quality and authenticity, that within a few decades, dozens of other distilleries were illegally attaching the name Glenlivet to their own labels just to ride its reputation. Eventually, the courts had to step in and rule that only George Smith's distillery could actually call itself the Glenlivet. Just 8 years after the Excise Act transformed the legal landscape, a second revolution arrived. In 1831, a man named Aeneas Coffey patented a new kind of still. His design, now known as the coffee still or the column still, allowed whiskey to be distilled continuously, instead of in batches. This was a mechanical breakthrough that seems dry and technical until you understand what it actually meant. Before the coffee still, every batch of whiskey made in Scotland was a handmade individual product. The coffee still meant you could run grain through the distillation process endlessly, producing a lighter, smoother spirit in massive quantities with consistent quality every single time. Scotland now had the legal framework to make whiskey openly and an industrial method to make it efficiently. But the industry still needed one more ingredient. It needed a product that could travel the world. That product arrived in the 1860s when a Scottish entrepreneur named Andrew Usher began experimenting with blending. He discovered that by combining the smoky, intense character of traditional malt whiskey with the lighter, smoother grain whiskey produced by the coffee still, you could create something that was far more appealing to a broad audience. Blended Scotch whiskey was born. It wasn't as rough as pure highland malt. It wasn't as bland as pure grain. It hit a perfect middle point that suited people who had never touched whiskey before. Suddenly, the great Scottish blending houses began to emerge. Names that you would recognize immediately even today. Johnny Walker, Dewars, Chivers Regal, James Buchanan. These men weren't just distillers. They were salespeople of almost supernatural ability. They took their bottles and carried them across the British Empire, into Asia, into the Americas, into Africa. They convinced bar owners, merchants, and royalty that Scotch whiskey was the most sophisticated drink in the world. They built the foundations of a global brand without calling it branding because the word hadn't been invented yet. And then fate intervened in the most unexpected possible way. From the other side of the English Channel. In the 1860s and 1870s, a tiny insect called the phylloxera louse arrived in Europe from North America. It fed on the roots of grapevines, and it was absolutely devastating. Over the following decades, the phylloxera beetle destroyed more than 2/3 of all the vineyards in France. The wine industry collapsed, and with it, the brandy and cognac industry collapsed too. French cognac, which had been the preferred luxury spirit of the wealthy classes across Europe and much of the world, simply vanished from the market. Bottles that had been produced before the plague sold at extraordinary prices, and then they ran out entirely. The rich, the powerful, and the comfortable were suddenly without their favorite drink. They needed something to replace it. And right there, on the other side of the channel, the Scottish blending houses had exactly what was needed. A high-quality, complex, aged spirit that was available in growing quantities and at a competitive price. Scotch whiskey stepped into the gap left by cognac and never stepped back out. By the time the French wine and cognac industry recovered, which took decades, Scotch had already replaced brandy as the prestige spirit of choice across Britain, its empire, and much of the Western world. A natural disaster in France had accidentally completed what Scottish distillers had been working toward for generations. The world had been handed to them on a silver tray. The next chapter in Whisky's rise sounds, at first, like it should have been a disaster. In 1920, the United States introduced Prohibition. Alcohol was banned. The largest single consumer market in the world had closed its doors. For many in the Scottish whisky industry, this looked like a catastrophe. But reality turned out to be much more interesting. Prohibition didn't stop Americans from drinking. It just made drinking more exciting, more transgressive, and more associated with a particular kind of cool rebellion. Scotch whisky that managed to reach American shores during Prohibition, often through Canadian smuggling routes and Caribbean supply chains, became associated with sophistication and daring. Wealthy Americans who found their way to illegal speakeasies were drinking Scotch. Movie stars, gangsters, politicians, everyone who was anyone was seen with a glass of amber liquid. By the time Prohibition ended in 1933, Scotch whisky had something far more valuable than legal sales. It had a myth. It had become the drink of people who didn't follow the rules. And in America, that is an extraordinarily powerful thing to be. When legal sales opened back up after Prohibition, Scotch moved into American bars and homes with enormous momentum. The Great Depression slowed things down. The Second World War slowed things down more, rationing grain and interrupting trade routes. But after the war ended and economies began to recover, Scotch whisky exploded into global consciousness in a way that no one had quite anticipated. The 1950s and 1960s saw the industry grow at a pace that was almost difficult to track. New distilleries opened, old ones expanded. The great brands of Scotland became the drinks of choice for the rising global middle class. And Scotland was collecting the rewards, quietly, consistently, year after year. Now we come to the part of the story that most people know, or think they know. In 1969, large commercial oil reserves were discovered beneath the North Sea, not far from the Scottish coast. The timing felt almost miraculous. Britain in the late 1960s was economically struggling, dealing with industrial decline and energy crises. And suddenly there was oil. Enormous quantities of it. The kind of discovery that rewrites a nation's economic future. Extraction began ramping up through the 1970s, and by the 1980s, North Sea oil was genuinely transforming the British economy. Tax revenues from oil and gas peaked at the equivalent of over £29 billion in real terms in 1984. Politicians began talking about oil wealth as if it were permanent, as if it were simply a faucet that could be turned on whenever needed. But there were serious problems with this picture, and they became more visible over time. First, and most critically, the revenues were almost entirely going to the UK Treasury in London, not staying in Scotland. Scottish politicians debated and argued about how much of their own oil Scotland actually controlled. While they debated, the money flowed south. Second, the oil was running out. Not immediately, not visibly at first, but the geology was working against the drillers. Production peaked in 1999 and began a long, steady, irreversible decline. By 2015 and 2016, Scotland's Geographic share of North Sea revenue had fallen all the way to £60 million. Not 60 billion, not 6 billion, 60 million. A tiny fraction of what it had once been. The oil bonanza, which had felt like a permanent transformation, turned out to be a pulse. A dramatic, wealth-generating pulse that lasted roughly 30 years and then began fading. Nobody had saved the money the way Norway had. Norway, which discovered its North Sea oil around the same time, set up a sovereign wealth fund and deposited its oil revenues into it. Today, that fund is worth more than $1 trillion and provides for Norwegian citizens in perpetuity. Britain spent its oil revenues on tax cuts and current expenditure. When the oil faded, very little of the permanent wealth remained. Scotland got noise, some employment, some infrastructure in Aberdeen, and then watched the boom slowly deflate. Now compare that to what whiskey was doing during exactly the same period. While oil was being extracted and sold and spent, whiskey was being made and aged and stored and exported and reinvested. In 2022, the Scotch whisky industry generated £7.1 billion in total value for the UK economy. Out of that, £5.3 billion stayed in Scotland, not sent to a distant capital, not handed over to international oil companies, kept in Scotland, flowing through Scottish farms, Scottish cooperages, Scottish bottling plants, Scottish distilleries, and Scottish export businesses. More than 41,000 jobs in Scotland are directly or indirectly supported by the whisky industry. An additional 25,000 jobs exist across the wider UK in related sectors. And here is the detail that tells the whole story in a single number. Right now, at this very moment, 22 million casks of maturing Scotch whisky are sitting in warehouses across Scotland. Each one of those casks is an investment. Each one is growing in value as the whisky inside it ages. Each one represents future export revenue, future employment, future tax revenue, future wealth. You cannot store oil that way. You cannot put oil in a barrel for 12 years and sell it for 5 times the price. But whisky works exactly like that. The very act of waiting makes it more valuable. Time is the distiller's greatest tool, and Scotland has an unlimited supply of it. By 2024, Scotland's distilleries attracted 2.7 million visitors. Not 2.7 million bottles purchased online, 2.7 million actual human beings who traveled to Scotland, often from far away, to stand inside a distillery, smell the spirit, see the copper stills, and understand where the liquid in their glass actually came from. This makes whisky distilleries collectively the single most popular tourist attraction in the entire country. The highlands and Speyside, which would otherwise be remote and difficult to access, are now destinations. Hotels, restaurants, transport, guides, and dozens of other industries feed off the tourism that whisky generates. Oil rigs don't attract tourists. They don't create a reason for someone in Japan or Brazil or Australia to book a flight to Scotland. Whisky does. Today, the scale of what Scotland has built around this single product is almost hard to comprehend. There are 154 operating distilleries across Scotland as of 2026. They range from the giant industrial producers of grain whisky in the Central Belt to tiny craft operations on remote Scottish islands where a handful of workers make a few hundred barrels a year. Every single one of them must legally mature their spirit for at least 3 years in oak casks on Scottish soil. This requirement, baked into law, means that the economic activity cannot easily be moved elsewhere. You cannot take a Scottish single malt distillery and set it up in cheaper premises in another country. The product itself is geographically locked to Scotland by both law and taste. The smoky peat character of an Islay whisky cannot be replicated in a factory in Asia. The mineral freshness of a Speyside malt cannot be copied in a warehouse in America. The product is the place, and that is an economic protection of almost unparalleled power. In 2023, Scotland exported £5.6 billion worth of whisky, which comes out to 43 bottles every single second. India has overtaken France as the largest export destination by volume, with nearly 200 million bottles shipped in a single year. The United States remains the most valuable single market, purchasing close to £1 billion worth of Scotch in 2024 alone. Asia Pacific as a whole has grown by nearly 27% compared to pre-pandemic levels. China, Singapore, Japan, and emerging markets across Southeast Asia are all drinking more Scotch than ever before. Whisky accounts for 90% of all Scotland's food and drink exports. It is not a product that Scotland makes alongside other things. It is the product. Everything else is secondary. And what about quality? The premium single malt category, which really began its global rise in the 1980s when Glenfiddich first started marketing directly to consumers, has transformed the economic profile of the industry entirely. A premium aged single malt whiskey can sell for hundreds of pounds per bottle. Rare bottles sell for tens of thousands. Some exceptional bottles have sold at auction for over £2 million each. This is a product whose value grows with time, whose prestige increases with age, and whose global appeal shows no sign of weakening. No oil barrel has ever appreciated in value while sitting in a warehouse. So what is the real lesson buried inside this extraordinary story? Why does it matter, not just to Scotland, but to anyone trying to understand how lasting economic wealth actually gets built? The difference between whiskey and oil is not really a story about liquid. It is a story about roots. Oil was something Scotland found. Whiskey was something Scotland made. And there is an enormous difference between those two things. What you find can be taken from you, depleted, monopolized, or simply run out. What you make, especially when what you make is tied to your land, your water, your culture, your centuries of accumulated knowledge, cannot be so easily stripped away. Nobody can drill for Scotch whisky in another country. Nobody can synthesize the particular combination of Scottish water, Scottish peat, Scottish oak maturation, and Scottish distilling tradition in a laboratory somewhere and sell it as the same thing. The law protects it. But more powerfully than any law, history protects it. The story protects it. The 200-year legacy of distilleries, the 500-year record of Ushgeber, the romantic and complicated truth of smugglers and monks and merchants who carried bottles across the British Empire. That story is part of what you are buying when you buy a bottle of Scotch. And that story cannot be exported to a cheaper location. There is also a lesson here about time. Oil asks for speed. Extract it quickly, sell it immediately, capture the revenue before prices change or technology makes it obsolete. Whiskey demands patience. A master distiller filling a cask today knows that the whiskey inside won't be ready to drink for at least a decade. Some of Scotland's most valuable expressions spend 30, 40, even 50 years maturing before they're bottled. That enforced patience creates something oil never could: a genuinely long-term perspective. The decisions made in a Scottish distillery today are decisions being made for the economy of the 2040s and 2050s. That kind of thinking builds differently than the quarterly profit targets of an extraction industry. And then there is the matter of what happens to the money. Whiskey's economic benefits spread wide and stay close to home. The barley comes from Scottish farms. 90% of the barley used by the Scotch whisky industry is sourced within Scotland. The oak casks are maintained and repaired by Scottish coopers. The distillery workers live in local towns. The tourists who come to see the distilleries sleep in local hotels and eat in local restaurants. The wealth circulates. It doesn't flow through a pipeline to an international company's headquarters in Houston or London. It settles into the local economy in dozens of small transactions that add up to something genuinely transformative for communities that might otherwise have very few economic options. Today, if you drive through the Speyside Valley in the Scottish Highlands, you will pass more working distilleries per square mile than almost anywhere else on Earth. You will see warehouses by the hundreds, low, dark buildings where millions of casks sit quietly in the dark, their contents slowly changing with each passing year. You will smell something in the air near the distilleries, a faint, sweet, peaty, almost magical scent that locals call the angel's share. That is the whiskey evaporating slightly through the wood of the casks as it ages. The angels take their cut, the distillers say, and what remains becomes more pure, more concentrated, more valuable than what went in. There is no better metaphor for what Scotland has done with this industry over 5 centuries. Time, patience, and skill have taken something simple and transformed it into something extraordinary. Oil was a gift, and gifts run out. Whiskey was built, piece by piece, law by law, bottle by bottle, year by year. And it keeps building. Every second of every day, 44 more bottles leave Scottish shores. Every year, another generation of distillers fills new casks that won't be opened for a decade or more. Every season, more tourists arrive to stand in the same spots where monks once made aqua vitae, and to taste, in a single glass, 500 years of a nation's most unlikely and most enduring success story. The oil is fading. The whiskey, quietly and powerfully, keeps flowing.